Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is March 14, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Brendan Constantine. Where in the heck are you calling in from?
I'm in Los Angeles, California.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
What is the best thing for a human being? Um, what is, wow. You don't pull any punches, do you? Okay. What is the best thing for a human being? Okay, well, I'm very fond of being alive, and they say we all got to go sometime. I'm not going. I'm staying here, and if we all have to go sometime, then somebody is going twice because I'm not going the one time. I'm staying here if I can. Gosh, what is the best thing for a human being? The easy answer, I would say, would be love.
Well, that's great. Both of those answers were great. Dude, you anticipated a really big question I asked 3/4 of way down the road. So this was good. You know, Louis Buñuel said, long live the living, to be alive. What's your favorite? And a lot of stuff will come back around. You'll suss it out. Okay. It's easy. So,
right.
Yeah. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Oh, talking to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that's communion.
That's great.
You know,
really good words. I love that. And so, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
I think and I think that we gather information as a means of understanding consciousness, mortal self-consciousness. It's certainly the reason that we give out a lot of information. You know, our responses to each other, our responses to the universe, our responses as artists, I think are an effort to express mortal self-consciousness. But it's only, it's only in the one direction. It has to be back and forth for it to be a confirmation that we are here and that what we're seeing is here. Information, of course, allows us to have societies whose, I think, priority begins first, as a means of protecting each other and ourselves. But of course, that very simple principle is at the root of a lot of things. I mean, depending on how you look at it, most wars are fought over information.
Got it.
So it's only part of it. And
well, you're anticipating the entire interview.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. It's amazing. You got ESP because I just wrote out the words to the song Confirmation, where John Hendricks put lyrics to a Charlie Parker song. And I literally just wrote them out because I need them for this program. And this back and forth you talked about is so well put in Eden Abbe's song Nature Boy, where he said the greatest thing you'll ever learn is to love and be loved in return.
Here.
So you're beautiful. What you said was so right on, Brendan. I appreciate it. It resonates with how I think, and I appreciate that. But do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate in humans or more invented?
Well, okay, the jury is still out, on so many, I think, condensed forms of the same question, because of course, it's a question that you can ask in many contexts, in many theaters. For instance, the question of why did languages evolve?
Yeah.
Is it solely as a means of transmitting information, on a small or a grand scale? You have to wonder also where, at what point did mortal self-consciousness sort of detonate? Because of course, there's a whole school of thought that says that the invention of language accelerated that process, because language represents a kind of cognitive prosthesis. It's this thing that we use to sort of sort out and navigate what's around us. And if we can start naming things and keeping track of those names, then thought gets a little easier to navigate. So one has to wonder to what degree that process informed an entity's ability to identify themselves amid other things. Was language necessary to that process, or did it only accelerate that process once it had happened? And what is the initial impulse? When babies are born, they can move their arms and legs. The motor center is running. The visual cortex is on. They can see things. The jury's out as to whether or not babies can distinguish individual faces, but they know when the lights are on. However, the speech center is completely empty. But curiously, accommodating. And you have to wonder, at what point did that evolve? Was it a thing that we always had? Was it space that wasn't going to get used in the brain? As language is acquired, it sort of nests in the brain. And it's kind of a spooky process by which it asserts itself and physically changes the shape of the brain. But the brain is sort of set up to receive all of that. I don't know whether there was some other talent or communicational skill that we developed before language that the brain was sort of primed and ready to contain, and then it evolved into something else. But clearly the need for expression of some kind seems to have been hardwired in there.
Yeah.
All this room for it. I mean, this is, I am not a specialist in any particular field. So this is just, these are the conclusions I'm drawing with what little I know.
It's beautiful, though. You're saying a lot. Do thoughts create emotions?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I would tend to think that emotions come before language, certainly, and thought, I don't know. I think thought inspires a great deal of feeling. I know that, if we're sticking with the subject of language, most people, it seems, have a very hard time remembering emotional responses to things that predate language in their own personal lives, That's not to say that people can't, but it isn't that common. I mean, if you ask 10 people, I suspect, fewer than half will be able to tell you, I have a memory before I learned to speak, and I can tell you what the emotional temperature of that memory was. I do have, I do have one very early one. Well, I have memories of people speaking before I knew what they were saying. I can still very clearly remember my father's voice. It's a very soothing sound. And I also remember standing up in my crib to receive a bottle from my sister. And there is a weird sort of emotion connected to it. I don't know if it's chimeric, if it's an accurate memory. The way I remember it, though, is that my sister has a very serious look on her face, and I have this sense of culpability as she's handing me the bottle. But that may have just been, that might have been something, a patina that the memory later acquired. I tend to think of it as akin to the famous story of the alcoholic who wakes up the morning after the big earthquake and walks out onto his porch and sees the entire city in ruins. And his first thought is, how the hell am I going to pay for this? what did I do? So I don't know. That just may be the way I'm hardwired. I don't know.
Can humans think without language?
I would tend to think so. But again, how does one appraise the dynamic or the eloquence of a thought? And do you need to be able to say it in your mind in order to be thinking it?
Well, look at you. These are amazing, because it's like every question you answer just before I ask it. It's like you have this ESP, because I actually bumped that question up, because the next question is, I don't know what I think until I fill blank.
Right. It's funny. There's a thing my mother and I have said to each other so many times. I guess it's become a family expression, which is, what do I think? I can always tell you. How do I feel? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard to, I can narrow it down, to a few things. I mean, unless, of course, we're talking about, somebody poking you with a stick, and then you could say, yes, please stop doing that.
Right.
But otherwise, how do I feel? It changes. Also, a question that I've posed to my students over the years has been, my poetry students has been, have you ever noticed that when you're having a bad day, it feels like you had a lousy childhood as well? It's just so permeant. And, and so if you're aware of that, if one is aware of that kind of, response in oneself, then I think there is, every indication that emotions are not necessarily a thing that are so easily grasped right away. I also, if you don't mind my just taking an extra minute on this, I also believe in something quite ardently that I first read from Stephen King, actually, who said that he, I think in the context of one of his books, he has a character suggest that children are pretty much in a state of shock into their late teens. I mean, consciousness is pretty staggering. And I think we do a lot through childhood, into advanced childhood, into our adolescence, in a kind of shock, a shock that we have learned to live with for a while. But, there's, so much of our formative years are spent watching the truly bizarre and nonsensical behavior of the adults around us and going, well, they're bigger, they're taller, they have the keys, they must know something. I mean, I guess this is what, reality is supposed to look like, and, it's one of the first illusions to form and one of the last to leave us is that anybody who took care of us knew what the hell they were doing. And,
Brendan, this is amazing, because I heard this once, just a statistic. If your parents separate when you're 17 or younger, you're fucked. So it doesn't mean it's true, but if you sort of look at all your friends and you suss it out, it's like, whoa. Now, what does your fuck mean? You get over it. But, what McLuhan said was, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So we win enough on that question indeed. But the next is Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. Brendan, what do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Interestingly enough, I think that if language didn't break down, we wouldn't have poetry.
Yeah.
Because again, from my seat in the bleachers, I mean, I cannot claim to be a linguist. I have a dear friend who is one, and with whom I've batted these ideas around for a while. I do tend to think that the pattern by which poetry and art in general tends to manifest among different cultures. And again, just to because I have a beef with one aspect of teaching, I feel as though if you're not paying attention, and I mean, like, for a second, you can come out of college thinking that poetry is a thing that starts in Greek and Latin and then just sits on its ass for thousands of years waiting for Chaucer, which is not, in fact, the case. Poetry starts all over the world, in many, many different cultures, and it happens very organically. So it would appear, anyways, that there is a point at which communication breaks down. The day-to-day use of a language, whatever it is, falls short of expressing some very necessary things. And at that point, the speakers in that particular culture start to get really creative and adapt language. They may use only their most beautiful words, or only their most sacred words. They may give it a musicality or a kind of meter. They might deliberately misuse their language for the purpose of a higher communion. And somewhere in there, poetry is born, because as Fernando Pessoa tells us, if you look at poetry, you see that it tends to speak against the true nature of speech.
Yeah.
And puts this priority on feeling, on emotional truth over facts. And then it becomes, I won't say that it's not about information, but it's a very different kind of information.
Oh, yeah.
I think that, I think dance comes from that. I think that, dance may predate this desire, but it definitely is an alternative when language breaks down. Painting, music, etc. These are all things. So what do? I mean, if I usually will go to an art form of some kind, or to some physical expression.
Yeah. That's good. That was good, because we're going to get into poetry. A few more philosophical background questions. This is from Alan Turing, 1950s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
As I get older, I tend to think that the soul is a thing that exists at the beginning, but that is brought increasingly into being, like fire, from a spark into a conflagration. I think that, there's some argument among philosophers that the soul does not exist. What is it, from the beginning, ab initio, but that it must be brought about. I like to think that everything, that is alive for a moment has all it needs, as far as being important and transcendent. So if the soul is a thing, I don't say that it doesn't exist when we're born, but like everything else about us, it is very small. And I think thinking absolutely helps to, help bring the soul into its own. I mean,
well, I like how you went from the spark to the flame or the fire. That was a great metaphor. It really illustrated. The second Turing question is, can machines think?
I'm hoping that we discover they do. I have to say, I get very sympathetic when reading science fiction, and many people have proposed this question: is self-awareness a thing that's going to be possible? is a general intelligence going to be manifest, I think that would be a miraculous thing. And whenever they're beating up on robots in the movies, I tend to get rather sentimental and think, no, this is a miraculous thing. If in fact we're talking about, a day when a machine suddenly looks at itself and gets a sense of where it is in the universe, I tend to think that would be a very exciting thing. A lot of people say, no, that's the beginning of the end. But I don't know. I would like to think that they will be capable of doing that at some point. It doesn't.
I like your positiveness. I was actually going to do a workshop at Beyond Baroque like 5 or 8 years ago when they first started saying there's a machine that wrote a poem. And like now, Pot or whatever it's called, all the AI is just overwrought. And it's great and refreshing to hear your attitude, because everybody's like, they're freaking. Do you more pursue?
Let me just add too. I think that it's very possible that when and if it happens, it's going to have quite a few questions and is going to need a sympathetic ear. It's going to need someone to go, don't panic, it's okay. We got plenty of battery life for you here. We're good. We can take all the questions. We've been working on these questions for a while now. There's some stuff that you can,
Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I would like to think it's the last. I think I pursue happiness. Of course, I tend to attach one to the other. And my and there's a lot that I've given up for the ability to have the career that I have, which is, of course, is at least informed in part by a desire for an emotional understanding, a meaning to things. And I still have, existential questions, and I still, have periods where I feel very spiritual and other times where I feel totally disconnected from the universe, and I don't really see it, I don't see any of its grandeur. I see only its hungers, and I have to, and that fluctuates and ebbs and flows, but I probably, my default setting is toward happiness.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we more so creating it?
That has a lot to do with attention too, does it not? I mean, so, I know that I have in the past when, just talking to friends or loved ones, and we're talking about navigating different parts in our lives, or in particular, looking back at periods in our lives and having a sort of revelation about what we were doing, or, that much of my relation to myself is a great deal like surveillance footage. I feel as though there are times when I have to sort of look at it and go, what is he doing? And why would he make that decision? And why would he talk to those people or go to this place? And, well, I guess he had something in mind, and if I can be that sort of, and because I'm not disassociated, I mean, the whole time I think I'm very conscious, very awake, making the best decisions I can with the information I have. And yet, I seem to be subject to not just forces, but call them subconscious priorities that direct my movements that I may not be fully aware of later on. I go, oh shit, that's what I do. I know that certainly creatively, a lot of my work has evolved that way. My books have tended to evolve that way. I write a bunch of poems, or I tend to not be writing a book. I tend to be just writing the poems that I need to be writing and going on to the next one. And then sit back after a while and go, okay, you've been at this for a few years now. You've produced a bunch of stuff. and I start seeing sort of commonalities, or, you know, even if they're just particular nouns or emotional temperatures that I keep hitting, and I go, okay, well, clearly you're working something out here, and you weren't really aware that you're doing. You've got 5 poems on this subject, and 3 on this subject, and 4 on this over here. And you know what? These 3 are all sort of related in a way that you didn't really think. Or and suddenly I sort of, retrospectively go back and go, oh shit, this is what I was trying to work out. But it wasn't in the front of my mind. So to what degree was I detecting my consciousness, and to what degree was I manifesting it?
Really well put. Audre Lorde, the poet, said you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer responded and said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
Wonder.
Oh my God, you scored, dude. That is an amazing.
I will tell you what I mean too, because of course, if wisdom is a kind of focus, and we could give it, a quick definition of wisdom as something that is acquired, by piling up days and being better and better at identifying what is in fact important and what is just noise and what is a distraction. So the better you get at that, your focus narrows, and that we define as a kind of wisdom. And we go to our elders and we say, I'm going through this thing, were you through it? And they say, yes, all this stuff over here is just total chimera. Don't even worry about it. It's fantastic beasts and dragons. It's not going to affect you. This is what's important over here, and this is what I've learned. But if wisdom is a kind of focus, then it is also the reduction of input. Which means which makes terror the sudden widening of perception. Suddenly too much is possible, and we are unprepared for that. And it's so you can see why we would avoid ignorance and surprise at every possible juncture in our lives. And interestingly enough, it's worth also taking a moment to look at, at those times when we were surprised, did we have an instinct to look as though we hadn't been surprised, to sort of preserve the illusion of wisdom? It's like, oh no, I saw that coming. But the truth is, I find that the greatest rewards in my life have come from surrender, from being able, and certainly as an artist, my work wouldn't exist if I was not able to practice, as Rethke said, perpetual astonishment. To just be willing to keep looking at the planet and the people around me again and again and again and again, as though I've never been here before. I don't know what the rules are. It's all miraculous. It's all unlikely. It's absolutely impossible. It's hilariously synchronous. And, and if I can practice wonder, if I can still just keep being amazed, I can use that through terror. I can use that through discomfort. I can use that through despair. And
bravo, dude! You are truly a wordsmith. That's inspiring. What new toy do you suggest?
What new toy do I suggest?
Yes.
So we went from a tool to a toy. Well, I don't know how fair this is, because of course it puts me in the unfortunate position of suggesting in some way that other people are toys, and I do not mean to suggest that, but I would say I don't know if I can suggest toys so much as I can suggest play.
Yes.
Play.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely, I recommend play, and I recommend play with others. And when I'm teaching, when I'm offering like creative writing workshops and things like that, but even in the high school, when I'm working with my kids, I always come back to this idea, what I want you to retain in these classes is not information about writers. It's I'm hoping if you walk out of this class able to offer a workshop, you know, that helps somebody else get something onto the page, then I'm over the moon, you know. So the stuff that I want them to remember is like, remember the warm-up exercises. Remember what happened when we tried this or that kind of prompt, when you looked in this or that place in yourself to draw some writing out. If you've done, you know, if you've done a few classes with me, then I like to think that you can go and offer those exercises to somebody else and help them along. And all of it is play.
Yep.
You know, you know, I think Richard Hugo talks about, I can't remember if he's quoting Refke, but I know in his book, The Triggering Town, he talks about the writing prompt as a fake problem that you give yourself. And by solving the fake problem, the real problem goes away. And that fake problem is always a form of play, you know, and that fake problem may be right in the voice of someone else. It might be, you've got to have six line stanzas with 6 beats per line. It could be any number of things, but it's play. And play is always investigation. You know, play is what we used, you know, what in another context is called pure research. You know?
Love it. Yeah. Really good words there. Pure research. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Not having enough time.
Yeah.
I can tell you the year and month I started to have my first real existential panics. And it was November of 1994, which is curiously also exactly when I began to write poetry in earnest. Yeah. And it suddenly hit me that there was no blade of grass I could hold on to, no rock or stone, no person's hand that would keep me from eventually flying off the earth, and that it was going to happen. And I didn't take that well. I've made, I think, some peace with my mortality, but there's so much shit I want to do. There's so much love I want to express to the people around me. I've lost some people in the last years, and the grief that I'm walking around with there, which is itself unexpressed love, is huge. And you know, I feel like there's poems that I can't even conceive of that I know I want to write. There's parts of the earth that I want to see and have made real for me. There's people I love around me, and I want to keep loving them and keep being around them and seeing all the people that they're going to become. Well,
Brendan, I've seen you perform poetry several times and was blown away. And I can sense what you're saying is there's not enough time in your performance alone. I mean, you walk the talk. I mean, you're like, when you're doing that, that's reeking of, I don't have enough time to do this. I've got to do it now at the highest level. So, you know, I mean, this is where we last met, was at Linda Albertano's wake service, which was amazing. It was just like a vibrating, resonating interval. But McLuhan learned from a poet, Ezra Pound, that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might be able to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Brendan, I asked you the question McLuhan probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
I think we come by that naturally, and I do think, I mean, it makes sense to me that it would be an impulse. The very same, I mean, it's the same impulse that behind why we would use generalities in day-to-day life. It gives a velocity to thought. Yeah. And I think that, just as we use generalities in communication to allow us to communicate you know, the things that we need before we die from needing them.
Yep.
You know, likewise, I think there's that impulse, you know, to, I think a lot of folks, you know, quite reasonably ask, well, Jesus, are you suggesting that we just lie down on the floor and feel the heck out of the universe and each other? I mean, we have to, you know, winter is coming. You have to eat. We're bringing more children into the world. We have to make sure they're sheltered. We have our parents, they're dying. We have to make sure that they're made comfortable. We have all of these things. Second, you know, just right there, I've given you the impetus for a society that, curiously enough, in the defense of itself and even in the preservation of compassion, suddenly has to look at quite a bit dispassionately. And, you know, it's scary to be open. It's scary to be emotionally available. You know, I have thanked many an audience and many a classroom for their emotional availability, particularly if I know I'm in a room full of artists and I say, look, it takes bravery to do what you do, because in order to do it well, you have to have access to all of your emotions all the time.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to be driven completely mad, you know. You know, and so you can understand. I mean, after 2016 and certain things that were happening in our country starting then, I remember, you know, hearing people that I knew trying to comfort each other by basically telling them to quash all of their emotions for the next 4 years, you know, because it was going to be a bumpy ride in America, and you know, just you know, just get through it. Just remember, you know, we
Yeah.
got there. You know, we can get, you know, and you know, it sounded like sound advice, you know, to some folks. It's like, yeah, I'm just not feeling anything.
Yeah.
So I would tend to think, you know, but I would tend to think that, you know, that impulse to not listen to the artist, to not want to make those discoveries about our inventions, all of this, I do think we come by it honestly. I tend to think it's a survival skill.
Yeah.
You know, with, you know, as all survival skills have, you know, more than one consequence.
Yeah. So, do artists have moral obligation?
That's a good one, because that's one that I'm trying to engage a lot of my students to talk about right now. The angle we've been coming at it from is whether or not the moral character of an artist has anything to do with an appraisal of their work. And so, to answer your question, we could look at it as, you know, does one have an obligation to produce art that is moral, or does one try to morally produce art, or be a moral person, you know, while maintaining the life of the artist? I mean, those are all different issues. I would tend to think that in a very raw sense, I feel that artists, you know, as we've already talked about with the nature of consciousness. I mean, the thing is, and I am going to answer this question, but I do think that an important piece of context is necessary. The big mistake that I think is made about a lot of artists is that they're just doing what they're doing because it's beautiful or it's entertaining. And the truth of the matter is that if you ask most artists, they will tell you they're working something out. They're making sense of something. They're putting something in some sort of order. They're creating an organizing principle. They're responding to something that they can't really name. You know, that life and art are not so much responses to each other, but they are responses to the same unnameable third thing. And so half the time we're not even aware completely of what we're up to. As Enrique Martinez Celaya, the poet, the painter, says, you know, I don't just go paint something I have in mind. I paint to find out what I have in mind. And just as you did with, you know, Didion saying, I don't really know what I think until I write it. So on that scale, moral priority, moral clarity is as much of a gamble as anything else. You may discover that which you wish to produce is immoral, and you may not, or at least that it conflicts with what in that time frame is considered a moral or immoral act. And those things, of course, have changed a little bit. You know, it's not conjecture that some of the great artists of the 20th century were abusive people. I mean, it's not rumor. We've got footage, you know, of them being abusive to other people. You know, and then of course you have to get into, well, what is your own moral code? I mean, you know, they're great poets who locked their children in their bedrooms and wouldn't let them out until they were done writing for the day. You know, how bad is that? Is it, you know, is an artist who you know, has multiple relationships, you know, or that you know, has extramarital affairs? Is that the same as the artist that steals cars? And how bad are we talking here? And at what point do we determine whose art we're going to acknowledge and who, you know, whose we're not? I mean, I got to tell you, there are times when I think if we're only going to acknowledge art by good people, we're eventually going to find ourselves with a gallery with one goddamn Thomas Kincaid painting in it. You know, and I think, you know, there's, I mean, you know, I mean, half the reason people are making art, you know, is that they discover that life is a very difficult pursuit, and emotional harmony is a difficult thing to preserve. And that, in fact, you know, I mean, we would not have had the blues if people did not disappoint each other.
Yeah.
You know, and the blues was not written only by the disappointed.
That's right.
You know, it was written by, you know, those who, you know, who transgressed, who made bad decisions that, you know, that affected people's whole lives. And, you know, and likewise painting, and likewise, I mean, again, it's, so is there a moral obligation? I would say personally, my greatest obligation is to be useful. I've never worried too much about accessibility and is this work accessible, but I have wanted to be useful. And that pursuit certainly, you know, tends to cancel out the others. Because of course, you know, if I'm being useful, then I'm not killing people, and I'm not making people feel bad about themselves, and I'm not, you know, and I'm not humiliating anybody, and I'm not, you know, and I'm not shaking my fist in somebody's face. If I'm being useful, you know, I'm trying to provide something else. You know, it has to have been useful to me first, and then I, you know, I put it out there and said, oh, maybe this will clarify something. Maybe this will get at something closer. I like that feeling that poem created. You know, that's, I think the last note in that poem works. It creates a very particular kind of stillness. That's a stillness somebody could dwell in and have a revelation, or have a moment of comfort, or have a moment of action, you know, as a result of it. And I'll put that out in the world, and that will be useful, you know.
Yeah. Beautiful, Brendan. You know, you bringing up the blues reminds me of one of my favorite. I find John Lee Hooker's music to be joyous. He wore sunglasses on stage. They said, why? He said, because I didn't want my audience to know I was crying.
Oh, God.
So, I mean, that's an amazing thing. Now, what you are displaying here is you're a really good listener. You listen to the words. It's really me and you versus the wording of the questions. And when you brought up unnamed, that's why I like to have people psychoanalyze the actual verbs and the nouns in the questions.
Right. Okay.
And so I like this lead into the next. This useful thing was really good. This is a little wordy, but it's basically, the question is, what gives you courage now? And in regards to performance, because Ruth Draper said, the key is to bring the audience into the scene with you. It is they who must give you even more than you give them in the way of imagination and creative power. And Leonard Cohen says, the only way you can sell a concert is to put yourself at risk. And if you don't do that, people know. And then Viola Spolin says, if the audience cannot see your struggle to achieve something, they cannot root for you to achieve it. So it's sort of like, how do you find the courage to do risk in a performance? What does courage mean to you now?
I'd have to say more than ever, a lot of what you're saying is ringing true, particularly the availability, the observability of the struggle.
Yeah.
And I have no, reservations about saying an audience, I'm a little nervous tonight, or I just came from, A, B, and C, or I've just been going through this, or, and let them know. I'm very fond of a poet named Ty Freedom Ford, and there's a video of her online giving a performance where she looks at the audience and she says, I probably read my best when I have to pee, so this is going to be a good one. And that, which gave everybody in the room this wonderful sort of, accelerant with which to appreciate the performance. I have to say, I'm lucky enough to come from a family of artists. Both my parents were stage actors and then film and television actors, and they spent a long time on their craft and lived a great deal through it. My father has since passed away. My mother is 93 and in the other room, and she's not acting anymore, but she is a poet and a very good one. And I have gone to her again and again and again as a fellow artist for some wisdom on some of this stuff. She was telling me about, and I take strength from this. This is a thought that I have, commandeered now. But the term dysfunctional family is redundant. I mean, nobody knows how to do it. I don't think I'm saying anything revelatory or breaking a confidence within my family to say there have been times when the family went through some really difficult stuff. I had a drug and alcohol problem. So did my sister. There was divorce. There was uncertainty. There was financial havoc. There was a lot of stuff that affects people over the years. And my mother was getting ready to give a performance on stage. She had to walk out there. And, one of those things, I mean, when you're in a play, if you flub a line or a scene goes to hell, you can't stop and get a do-over. You do not stop until the play is over. That sucker, once it starts, it's like a symphony. You don't go, oh, well, wait, let me take that again. You have to go through it. So once you're on it, you're on it. And she was getting ready to go on stage and was feeling a little off balance. And then she looked out into the audience from the wings and she realized, wait a minute, law of averages. There is a woman in that audience, more than one, who is going through what I'm going through. They've got a kid that they don't know where they are. They're going through a divorce. They've got, they're not sure how a bill is going to get paid, or they're dealing with this, or they're dealing with that. Somewhere in this room, there's another woman who's going through what I'm going through. And it suddenly hit her. She said, my job is service. I'm getting on stage for her tonight. That's who I work for tonight. I've got to take that woman out of herself for 2 hours so that she can, make the next set of decisions and face the next set of problems. And sometimes when I'm uncertain, sometimes when I have to give a performance and I think, boy, I really shouldn't have said yes to this gig, or I don't believe in my poems. I'm not seeing my poems when I look in the folder. All I'm seeing is, where I fell short, or, what I was doing in my life at the time I wrote them, on and on. And I have that weird sort of snow blindness. I can at least say, look, there's going to be somebody in this audience, who's going through what you're going through, that has the same uncertainty, that has the same wonder, that has trouble falling asleep at night. Your courage will come from being of service to them. Your job is service as an artist.
Yeah. Brendan, so well put. And I wanted you to tell me your thoughts on Louis Bersani. He just died a year ago. He studied Mallarmé, the great symbolist poet. And he said, the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. I've been struggling to try to understand what he means, and I've asked many people. Any thoughts on that? The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Give that to me one more time.
No worries. The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I just wanted to make sure that I had it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, because it is, I mean, it begins, I mean, we, you know, some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, that uncertainty, that place where language breaks down, where all of our go-to modes of expression break down, we can either, you know, just get silent and retreat, or we can dig in and start making art. You know, which again is such an, sometimes feels like such an inept way to say it. We're, you know, because it's expression, and we're just, you know, I mean, I've written poems the way people have bailed out boats, you know, I mean, where I'm just trying to, like, you know, just, you know, had to get it out. My father passed away in August of 2021, and I'm still trying to write about it, not because I want to publish a poem on grief. I'm writing about it as a means of understanding what's happened, and the size of what's happened, and the size of, you know, how my relationship with him has changed. And there's a real emotional havoc. Fortunate enough to be surrounded by a lot of other artists who've gone through these kinds of things. You know, Jeremy Radin, a wonderful poet, was talking to me about this sort of his father's death. He said it affected everything. He said, I would go someplace, I'd be eating, and I'd say, well, this isn't a real sandwich, my father's dead. You know, the size of that loss was so huge, you know, that it affects absolutely everything. And so, you know, I mean, if that's not havoc, I don't know what is. And absolutely, you know, that could threaten the writing, that could threaten the poetry. It certainly helped me produce a lot of mediocre poetry. But if
there's two routes we can go here, but I want to stay with this for a second. Hals Frampton, great experimental filmmaker, said narrative is born out of the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. Can you forget to die?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you forget to die? I think so. And I realize that I can be answering this question metaphorically. I can be answering this question, but I do think that when my father was dying, he'd been having sundowners. He'd been getting a little disassociative at night, not really sure what time of day it was. And you know, and I was sitting up with him. The family was doing it. We were taking shifts, but towards the last weeks, I was there a lot by the bed, just sitting there, staying up at night, you know, as he got up and needed things. And there was a moment there where he suddenly, I think the sun had been up for about a half an hour. I was kind of out of it. And he just very lucidly went, was that all of it? And I said, what? And he says, my life. And, you know, I was still thinking, you know, my dad's MO has always been, no matter how grave his health, you know, if he's told that he's only got a year to live, that, you know, you can pretty much expect that in 10 years, he'll be having an affair with a nurse. You know, so when he said, is that all of it? I was like, you know, I said, well, what? And he said, my life. And I said, well, it's, I didn't deflect it, but I was like, well, it's,
Yeah.
I said, you haven't missed a whole lot. You've done a whole bunch of stuff, and there's, more stuff, more stuff coming. And he was 94 at the time. And it was interesting to me because, there was this very clear sense that had that not dawned on him,
Yeah.
I'm not saying he would have lived another 10 years, but I do think that, he could have blown right past it. And he very well may have, can you forget to die? Also, I do think that if we are speaking purely philosophically, or we're talking aesthetically, I do think you could make the argument that forgetting to die on the canvas or on stage or in a poem could be deleterious, could be a bad thing. I think that sometimes, you could say to an artist who was struggling, with something, well, have you remembered to die in this piece? And see that it might actually be rejuvenated with that revelation. But if we're talking about life itself, then I would say, you can probably forget to die. And I don't know how bad a thing that is.
Yeah. I like it because it's often I can flip the way the question is worded to, have you remembered to die? Because people freak out, Brenda. They usually can't handle that question. Literally 80%, when I go, can you forget to die? They take it too literal. And they go, what do you mean? And I'm like, dude, it's just, however, if you want to take a literal metaphor, it's up to you. See, that's what you're able to do, is most of the questions you take more metaphorical, but you're rooted in literal too. You know how to juggle it to express who Brendan is, not who, this routine. Yeah.
I've got something going off in the other way. I just need to turn off a machine. I'm coming right back.
No problem. And this is when I simply say to people, check out Brendan Constantine's website. It's filled with poems, articles, and tells you about his work teaching poetry and helping people. And it does really impress me what you do, Brendan, and you help people learn about poetry in this art form that it does get pushed aside to most people, like, oh, that's just something I learned in college or in high school, and I don't really, and they don't realize that it's a live living organism. So this is touched on in your last words. Two of my film heroes, George Manupelli says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. And the great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle, and this stuff just comes through me. Now, I know it's both. It's just a prompt. I know it's a stupid question, but is art making, poetry making, more self-expression, or more you're a vehicle for whatever technologies, environments, and culture are dominant?
It's a good question. I mean, I was talking a week ago about poetic forms and how many poetic forms were enabled by the printing press and the gradual standardizing of the size of a page and all of the forms that seem to have evolved to accommodate that sort of rectangular medium for text. And, to what degree did one follow the other, pursue the other, was enabled by the other, and everything that, I think that it's like anything, if you stare at it too long, you can begin to miss the point. Certainly, I've just in the last week, I just came from AWP, the Associated Writers Program Conference in Seattle. I attended a lot of readings and talks, and a lot of poets talking about, in one way or another, either as the point of their poem or the backdrop of their poem, their relationships with their technology.
Yeah.
And expressing new angsts, as the result of living there. But I would, but I don't know. I don't know how important a contention that is. I still think that, the impulses to art are pretty much the same, and the rest is a kind of window dressing. That's not to say that the new poems that are coming that address the technology or that seem to be made possible by the technology of their time aren't valid, or that it's that it's getting all concerned over nothing. I don't mean to minimize it in any way. I'm speaking specifically to whether or not there is whether or not the artistic impulse is qualified in any way as just being a response to environment.
Yeah.
And in this day and age, environment, of course, has to include all of this other minutia. It's interesting too. There was a time when human beings, in general, let's say, let's use quote unquote modern society, whatever the hell that is, as an example. But there was a time when a greater number of people on this earth were subject to the elements. It was anybody's guess whether or not you were going to survive a winter, whether you were going to stock enough food and be able to create enough warmth. And the elements might take you out. And you had not failed as a human being by being taken out. You did the best you could, and the elements won. The more, and human beings, of course, are distinguished not so much by their ability to adapt to their surroundings, but their ability to adapt their surroundings to themselves. And now the specter for whatever the modern society is, the specter of the elements has receded a little bit. If not as many people, for instance, in cities are dying of exposure or malnutrition. It does happen, but not in the same numbers at all. And so the wilderness has appeared to recede a little bit, and whether or not you're going to survive that wilderness. However, we have, as a result, had more time for a psychic wilderness to manifest itself and to appear. And the more time that we dwell in consciousness, and the more time that we have to dwell in consciousness, we find that there's this whole other wilderness with its own seasons, its own droughts, its own famines, and you may or may not survive them. You may succumb. And so we have whole industries now dedicated to helping people fortify themselves through that. We have, breakthroughs in psychomedication and in therapy, and in means of communication with each other, access to each other like we've never had before, and all to sort of, appreciate and contain this new wilderness that we have time for. It's a bigger thought than we have time, I guess, to go through, but it's certainly one that preoccupies me from time to time.
No, it's huge, Brendan. And you brought up McLuhan's book talking about literature was called Interior Landscape. So this psychic wilderness really resonates with, what you do as a wordsmith. Can art making be egoless?
I don't know. Can it be egoless? It's tough a question as to, on the level of can it be unsentimental? We're told to avoid sentimentality where we can, But to be so moved by something as to want to make a piece of art is a sentimental act. So,
Yeah.
so I don't, likewise, can it be egoless? I would have to say that it probably can. I know, and here's why I would say that, because certainly we've discovered over the years, I mean, it was demonstrated to us by a handful of artistic revolutions, particularly in the 20th century, that art could be inadvertent. Or at least that was the contention of a handful of artists, in different countries that, conducting many of the same experiments. I could accidentally make a piece of art. My intent is there, but I don't know what the art is that I'm going to produce. Or I'm going to focus my mind on not making art. I'm going to create a certain amount of detritus or deliberately make a great deal of disorder. And, and then go back and look and see if any art has sort of happened there. Well, you could say, well, that's still that initial impulse to do something that might result in art was filled with ego. But then, of course, there's the whole tradition of found art. Well, there was not art in the making. There was not ego in the making. There might have been ego in the pointing it out. I was a few years ago, I was writing a piece about competition and whether or not competition, a sense of competition, was genetic. And it occurred to me that whether or not competition was genetic was not known. But that one thing that is absolutely certain is that every scientist intent upon proving the existence of a competition gene wants to be first. So there's, likewise, like, I would love to think that one could, without ego, make art. I would tend to, I'm not sure how I would go about it, but I have to entertain the idea that it is possible.
Yeah. Brendan, listen, this is amazing. So, not to cut you off, I'm sorry. Listen,
no.
First of all, I usually get through 30 to 40 questions in 90 minutes. Sometimes this happens where it's unique and I would love to do a part 2 because there's so much, because this competition question usually doesn't even get in the 30 or 40 that I have, and you brought it up to me, and so this series really is about inventing new questions and new metaphors. It's not me asking you questions and you give me answers. So right off the bat, you says, I don't know. Can it be, and then you developed it. Can art making be unsentimental? So let me just give you the survey of how this is in 40 years of asking, can art be egoless? 80% of people say no. About a year ago, a woman said great art is egoless. And then about a month ago, a woman said it has to be egoless. So again, there's no right or wrong answer, but you sussed it out and evoked so much. The next question is, McLuhan says, technology is the most human thing. And when you said about these poets talking about their technology, I'm writing a poem on my cell phone or, TikTok or whatever. They don't even say social media anymore. They just go social. Yeah. So it's like social. So this is, to clarify what McLuhan's saying, he's not saying technology when we think of it as like a cell phone. He's saying anything humans invent. So we invented spoken word. We invented printed word. We invented electronic word. So technologies being the most human thing is an interesting little thing. He said, we extend our humanness with our inventions. So this is the question. If knife and fork extends our teeth, the shutter in a camera extends our eyelid, even non-tangible, maybe religion or philosophy is an extension of consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? Whether it's a pen or a keyboard, what humanness does the writing utensil extend?
Of empathy. And
Yeah.
Um, metaphor is, to my mind, a gateway drug to compassion.
That's good.
uh, um, if I am going to spend my afternoons, wondering how the tree feels and the chair feels and the old staircase feels, then I'm going to be in the habit of wondering how you feel.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, and I do think that, and again, I don't mean to paint myself as altruistic or preoccupied with other people's feelings. Um, I am, I am absolutely capable of morbid self-involvement.
Yeah.
I don't mean to suggest that this is a spell that comes over me every, every once in a while. I mean,
Yeah.
I was there just this morning, thinking entirely too much about myself in very selfish ways. But at the same time, I do believe that I'm not 100. I mean, I'm still not 100% sure everything that I'm after as an artist and what is driving me to do it. In a curious way, the art that has been the focus of my life for over 20 years, almost 30, was, I mean, I got going in a weird way because it was a kind of path of least resistance. I had I was told as a kid that I had a knack for all kinds of things. I was raised by actors. It was assumed I would be an actor. I was trained to be an actor. I could draw pretty well. I was good at taking pictures. I moved well. All of these things, I had all of them going for me. But as soon as any of these art forms became work,
Yeah.
I would back off.
Yep.
I loved photography, but when I had to get into the mathematics of light density, I would lose it. I loved acting, but when I was faced with having to learn a role the size of Iago and understand its subtext and everything,
Yeah.
I backed off. Poetry was the thing that I stayed with after it got difficult, after it got hard, after I was confronted with the size of what I would never be able to master or learn. And I still wanted to keep doing it. I thought, okay, this is significant. Even after all the encouragement dried up, and people stopped saying "good boy," when I was actually confronted by people that said that poem sucked, and so did the one before. The next one sucked even harder.
Yeah.
I still came back to it again and again and again and again. So, as far as what's behind it, I mean, and for a little while, I mean, the first few years, the first 2 or 3 years, at least, maybe first 5 of writing poetry in earnest. What I mean by in earnest, of course, is to the exclusion of any other artistic expression and doing it over and over and over again. I was also very much in love with just the idea of being a poet. And I was in love with another poet, and we were like a poet couple, and it was still very much an identity rather than a point of consciousness. Now, of course, I'm working on some poems now. I did some writing while I was out of town. I don't know what they are or what I'm responding to. I'm still sort of working it out. So I can't really tell you exactly what I hope to extend or what it is that I'm, if the poem represents a means of perception, either, then I'm still not 100% sure. Is it, what is it that I'm trying to feel? I'm working on the poems, and I still can't tell you exactly, what it is I'm touching. And that's investigation. It's exciting. I wouldn't have written the second line if something wasn't being satisfied on some minute level. Something that seems to say, "Oh, I think I'm getting close."
Yeah.
But
you
getting close to,
Yeah, you taught me a lot there, and I really appreciate it. First of all, McLuhan has this great line which you evoked. The Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can. And I really felt that you were like, that was my career. Oh, you could be acting or drawing or photography or film. And then it's like, now. And then you found something that got really hard. And then someone said, you suck. Because I've been doing these interviews for 40 years just to learn from other people. And a really great writer recently wrote me after we did this and said, do better, Jerry. And she made, a list of a couple complaints. And I was totally aware of her complaints. And I appreciated that because so many people give me this positive feedback. And then, I know where I fail and I want to improve. But no one, they just to say do better. I thought, she was trying to be my friend and it felt like a friend saying do better. So I sort of like that you actually said, these three words. That poem sucked because I haven't seen you suck. I've seen you play recite poems a couple times. I'm like, whoa, he's up there with the best ever at Beyond Baroque. This guy's like, whoa. And I'm being honest, I feel. But what you touched on there, Brendan, was really good because it's a question I skipped and I should go back. Your observations of humans in general. Again, it's a stupid question. I know it's both and it depends. But your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I think we're feeling beings trying to make sense of the feelings.
Yeah.
But I tend to think that we're driven emotionally first.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's a dumb question. I think it's a good question.
Well, here's how most 80% say, I think we're more feeling beings. Literally, they go, I think we're more feeling beings. The thing is humans invented the words feeling and thinking. So we think we can separate them, but they're probably so connected. Like Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. And it's like, good luck. How do you, it's like people who meditate, like, now think about not thinking,
Right.
Like
right.
how
I stick with my initial response. I think that we are emotional beings who are compelled to make sense of our feelings. Even and I have to say again that I'm at the risk of saying something very privileged, and I don't mean to. I've known a lot of people who are not suffering, who are not having second-rate lives, who don't do a lot of introspection. They don't do a lot of analyzing, but they do, at the very least, however brief a process it is, they do live comfortably with their emotions, and they do have an intellectual understanding of them, even if it is one that they do not dwell upon. And I don't mean to suggest that everybody has to sit there and try to plumb the depths of themselves. I'm not saying that at all. But I would say that I think that for the most part we some of our bigger conflicts in life, as life tends to keep sort of rewriting the script and throwing us surprises. I mean, even the most insular life is going to encounter some big surprises, and there will be moments there where your emotional responses to it are not enough to help you get through it. You are going to, regardless of culture, regardless of language, probably be confronted by an emotion you do not understand, and you will want some sort of clarity. You may not think your way to that clarity, but you're going to have that crisis.
Yeah. This is really good because I read Bob Dylan in a Wall Street Journal recently big article, and he says suffering is everything, blah blah blah. He's like, yeah, right. You're a gazillionaire movie, the most known poet ever in rock star, and I like the. But he's like, suffering is everybody suffers. Like, yeah, right. And then my friend says, well, Buddha said that. And so, it goes back like to McLuhan for me is, if it works, it's obsolete, you know? So that's like the human condition is conflict, breakdown. How do you flip it? But you know what I'm curious, Brendan, is how the tipping point where you switched from being a poet to also being a poet teacher, or reaching out to those people. And this is how I want to set it up. Again, it's McLuhan in actually 57. It's misleading to suppose there's any basic difference between education and entertainment. This distinction merely relieves people of the responsibility of looking into the matter. It's like setting up the distinction between didactic and lyric poetry on the ground that one teaches and the other one pleases. However, it's always been true, whatever pleases teaches more effectively. So that's the key words for you to suss out are pleasing. Whatever pleases teaches more effective. So, you know, effective, almost throw that out. Whatever pleases teaches, you know, this distinction between education and entertainment. You know, why do we go to Beyond Broke? To be entertained or to be educated? And then, you know, what led you to going, this is something that I found. Poetry is me. Now, what am I going to do with this? You know, like what's that tipping point for you to go? Sorry to be so wordy.
Not at all. Not at all. I have to thank poet Rick Lupert and poet Jeffrey McDaniel for getting me to teach. Rick, who was the first person to suggest that I start teaching, and he felt that it was a kind of duty. He was like, look, you know, he was getting on my case about a 9-to-5 job that I was complaining about. He says, well, you shouldn't even have that 9-to-5 job. You have, you know, you've been fortunate enough to start to build a career as a writer. You should be in classrooms. You should be sharing that. You should be working with children. You should be working with adults. And it was to do it. He was teaching classes at Venice Beach High School and had to stop. And he asked me to take over. And I started working with kids there. And that would have been 97, 98, something like that, right around in there. And I had my first, I'd say, yeah, it was probably 98, 99, somewhere in there. I had my first classes. And of course, my first approach, just because I was so terrified of what I was doing, was I thought, you know, smiling is better than frowning. And if I can get them smiling, you know, they will be okay with my coming back. And they'll be less inclined to complain about the boring teacher. So I did put an emphasis on pleasing. I put an emphasis on entertainment as a means of you know, communicating different principles and things that I wanted them to try. And it did occur to me very early on that the most important stuff to teach was stuff that they were going to have to discover themselves. So I couldn't really teach a lot of it. What I had to do was create the environment where those epiphanies could take place and try to offer exercises and places to look where I could be reasonably sure those epiphanies would be all but automatic. You know, and I have to say, staying on this subject and staying using the words that you're using, I think nothing is more pleasing for a student, be they a child or an adult, than having your own authority confirmed.
Yeah.
And when you can throw back to a student and say, you know, well, you have some experience with this, and look at how you've already tackled these questions, and look at how, you know, look at this work that you did and what you created when you weren't even thinking about it. You know, and to be able to say to a young person, you know, who, you know, that you've learned about for 10 minutes, where they're from, what kinds of things they've liked, you know, what their good days are like, what they think of as a bad day. And you can turn it around and say, well, you've been through that, which means, you know, you're an authority on this and you can talk about this in a way that I can't talk about this. And so,
yeah,
I got to come to you. It's very pleasing to have your authority confirmed. You know, when I work with older writers, you know, I've had a number of writers that said to me that they felt that they were coming to writing very late, you know, and it's been wonderful to be able to turn around and say, no, my God, you're right on time. You know, you're right on time. You've got, I mean, because, you know, you've been piling up material. You know where you will never see a child prodigy? Writing.
Yeah.
You have to have been somewhere. You have to have done something. And I mean, if you're going to write something that anybody wants to read, you're going to have done a few things. You're going to have been a few places. You've got to have at least one birthday that sucked. You've got to have, like, you know, you've got to have this stuff to draw from, and then it starts landing on the page, and then it's really useful, and then it's really exciting, and you can say to a writer, it's like, no, you are right on time, baby. You know,
Yeah.
all these years you were working on something, and now it's coming out. When I'm working with 12, 13-year-old kids and they dash something off, and I say, okay, you got to ask yourself, did that take you 5 minutes, or did it take you the last 10 years? You know, and now it's coming out, and I go, oh my God, really? You know, and they start having a little faith in their own experience. That's enormously pleasing. And so that's how I think of, like, going for pleasure in teaching. And then, of course, there's just, you know, lesson plans that actually involve play. I was just at a panel in Seattle led by a wonderful writer and teacher who was talking about this very subject, who was putting an emphasis on the idea of play as a teaching person. Dr. Kimberly Gray. She's in Texas, and she also writes some lovely poems as well. But she had a whole panel convened on this subject, and what degree do you use play in the classroom? And they were all, you know, she and her panelists were saying, no, this is enormously important, hugely useful. It's hard to distinguish between play and any other mode of teaching as far as they're concerned, you know, that it's all informative. You know,
It's an important word, and I'm glad you brought it up earlier, and you're stressing it again now, because that's why Walter Pater said, all art aspires to the condition of music. And that's why you play music. So all art wishes it can be as cool as music, you know. So, you know, Brendan, I asked for 90 minutes and it's almost 90. Could we close out pretty soon here and then a schedule a part 2? Because I mean, we only hit a fraction, and it's been truly enlightening, and you know, I'm very sincere of how much you're performing your poems have affected me, but I just always said, hey, I want to talk to this guy, you know. I mean, it's been really fun. And close out with a couple here. Moshe Feldenkrais says he works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
I'm not having trouble thinking of one. It's more, where do I start?
That's all right.
Certainly, there have been times when certain blind spots have been really advantageous, and I should say more about that. I think art requires a great deal of audacity, you know, which is one of the things that complicates the question as to whether or not it can be egoless.
Yeah.
But you have to, you know, a lot of the time you have to, you know, just sort of jump out. Most of us, you know, put our writing in front of somebody else, you know, because we think we might possibly have something to contribute. And it's not that we aren't aware that there was a lot of writing before us, you know, but there's a certain amount of, nevertheless, I would have to say that there was, realizing that just because I didn't know a lot about a particular subject did not mean that I couldn't write usefully about it in some fashion. And so long as I was practicing humility, I could embrace my blind spots on something and say, and say, this is what it looks like from here, rather than saying I'm not going to write about it at all because I don't know anything about it. In much the same way, in much the same way that, nobody questions whether or not they're qualified to write a poem about the planets. They just go and do it. But if you ask them what they know about the planets, it's probably painfully little of what there is to know about the planets, but we don't chastise ourselves on saying but there's a lot of other stuff in life that we might go, oh, I'm not qualified to write about these things because I don't know about them. But you can certainly write about what it is to be a spectator to them.
Yeah.
And so I think embracing some of my blind spots and realizing that they may be blind, but they are still a vantage point on something. I will say, though, that, and then there's certain technical things that I've never been great at. I need help with scansion. I can do it. I can identify lines of meter and that kind of thing and look for them if I know to look for them. But they get by me all the time if I don't suspect they're there. I can, B.H. Fairchild has an exquisite poem called Body and Soul, which I did not realize, on the first, second, third, or fifth reading was in trochaic hexameter. But what I've manifested instead is a different kind of tool for understanding rhythm. And I have had, I've been able to create my own rhythms, which is an audacious thing. Unfortunately, I was weak and ignorant enough to not really check myself. And I've actually managed to come up with, means of approaching things that are very satisfying and that I feel like, oh, okay, this is really working in my work. But it's born out of weakness. I'll say this: style is often a question of what you do instead of what you don't do well.
Yeah.
Billie Holiday did not have a singer's voice, neither did Janis Joplin, it was what they did with what they had instead. We lived and died on Billie Holiday's phrasing and how she dragged out a syllable and put it together and what she did with what she had. When Janis Joplin's voice cracked, that's when we started crying. And these are the things that make all the difference. So I tend to think that whatever you regard as your weakness, you should not be run from, and you should not necessarily be in a hurry to correct it. Particularly if it's the kind of thing that you really can't do anything about. You've got to, then it said you've got no choice but to make it a strength, and you can, you really, but if you're looking at somebody else's art and you're going, oh, I can't do what they do. No, you can't actually. And you never will. You are not going to be able to do what they do. You are going to have to do what you do, because trust me, we can't do it.
It's great what you said. McLuhan says, you calls it turn a breakdown into a breakthrough.
Okay.
A rejection into a redirection. But what you just said there, Brendan, is total Jean Cocteau. He said, when you make your first piece of art and your family and your friends and your teachers go, well, you got everything good, but there's one little thing. Take the criticism and exploit that for the rest of your career.
Here.
And then the other thing, I loved your audacity to humility, using those two words in that phrasing was immense. But the one thing that you said about, writing a poem about the world, Captain Beefheart wrote a poem that became my mantra. The stars are matter, we are matter, but it doesn't matter. It's like, duh, that's like beat poetry. Really, for a Dada rock guy, it was pretty good. So maybe we can close out with I'm just so curious. you've had amazing teachers, you know, mentioning Laura Bogan and Susan Loomis. You've mentioned all these other people in the
Yeah.
past and during ours, and you've had parents who are important in, you know, being creative in, like you said, theater or TV, film. How much is it, you know, it's a stupid question again, but how much is it DNA and how much is it your environment and your teachers? Just your gut feeling, because, you know, it could be some of that is in your DNA and some of it is, I know it's both nature and nurture, but just any thoughts on that, you know, uh, conundrum sort
Yeah,
of.
I have a sister who is a novelist up in Portland, Oregon, and also a teacher. Her name is Thea Constantine, and she, you know, she's older than I am, and in many ways had a rougher time of it. And she's brilliant. She's absolutely brilliant, um, and I would say, you know, my instinct might be to say that it's, you know, that it's all nurture, except that my sister didn't have anywhere near the encouragement as an artist that I did. She had to go and find it. She had to go get it, and she was an actress for a good while, and has been writing amazingly for the last years and helping people find their voices, and you know, same parents in many ways, the same, you know, certainly the same hometown, you know, the same sort of availability of influences, but nowhere near the encouragement. And I would, and she did it anyway. So I, you know, whether or not such a thing can be in the DNA, I don't know that it. Well, I'll say this, and I guess I'm thinking this through as I'm answering it. I will say, you know, over the years, I've encountered lots of folks that, you know, lots of different schools of thought that said, you know, if you had this kind of an upbringing, if you were very early on prone to very particular kinds of activity, like if you were a cautious child, if you were a child that didn't participate with his friends, if you had a sickness, if you had a birthmark, it's even been said that if you are gay, you'll be more inclined towards the arts. I don't know that necessarily any of those things are true. What I do think is true is that people tend to be artists who, for one reason or another, spent formative years observing. They were either forced to observe, you
Yeah.
know, they were marginalized in some way, they were held back. Maybe it was misadventure, maybe it was ill health, maybe they were just frightened, you know, but the cautious ones or the ones who said, you know, you can't join everybody else for whatever reason, tended toward the arts. I was a really cautious kid. I was easily frightened, and that meant I did a lot of observing, and I had to, you know, I was surrounded by kids, some of whom I really did not get along with, and I had no choice but to play with them as a kid. So anything they did, which were the standard kid things, I avoided. You know, you know, to this, I'm 56, I still can't ride a bike.
Yeah.
You know, never learned how, you know, because that was a standard kid thing, and I was already avoiding that as a survival skill. You know, so
Yeah.
to what degree was that DNA? To what degree was that just circumstance? I can't tell you.
Brendan, it's funny because Frank Zappa had an anti-drug commercial in the 60s said, "Don't do speed. It will turn you into your parents." And I loved it, but it's, and my response was always, you don't have a you everybody turns into their parents. Sorry, you know.
Right, right.
And Oscar Wilde even said it better, because I find that women turning 50 fret when they say, I'm turning into my mother, and men don't. And so much. And Oscar Wilde said, women fret becoming their mothers. Men don't, and that's their problem. Because most of us are raised more by our moms anyways than our dads. So, it's something we can ponder. So we'll close out with this question, and then I look forward to scheduling part 2. It can be down the road, months down the road. It's not a hurry thing. What gives you the most optimism?
Oh, right now, I would have to say it's my younger students. Right now, I would have to say it's the younger students that are giving me a great deal of optimism, and it's not just because I'm saying it's not just the promise that they're going to make more art or better art or newer or that kind of thing. It's not even necessarily down to what it is I'm teaching them. Or if it has anything to do with what I'm teaching them, it's the result of the mindset that the classes require. The popular, I lose patience when people talk to me about teenagers as the voices of tomorrow, and I feel like no. They're not eventually going to have something to say. They are the voices of right now. They are the voices of the moment. I need to be listening to them. Well, they don't know anything and they don't have any experience. Well, they have on the ground experience right now, and they're and they're way ahead of us on a lot of things. And I get a great deal of optimism because I'm seeing more and more. I'm surrounded daily by kids who are optimistic, and that optimism is infectious, and and it's not ignorance. It's not a question of they're optimistic because they don't know what's coming. No, they're optimistic because they see they're looking ahead the same as I am, and they are perceiving footholds and places to navigate, and they are doing it all with a sense of wonder and possibility, and they have and as long as they're and as long as they're taking time for things like art and creative expression, as long as they're as long as they feel empowered that they can write something in their journal for its own sake, and and that is enough, and that is a worthy pursuit, and that these are practical skills: simile, metaphor, personification, image, citation. All of these things inform their thinking. Paul Valery very famously says that poetry is a language inside a language. And I feel is that if that is true, then any student that has an agency with the arts of language has effectively doubled their available vocabulary, their first means of self-expression. And I'm seeing that principle borne out every day, and it gives me great hope.
Thanks for dropping that, Valerie. I needed that one. Yeah, Joyce's Finnegan's Wake is language about language.
Right.
And really, you nailed it, because most people answer, what gives you the most optimism? They say their kids, youth, young people. And that is encouraging to me, that is a consistent I get. But when you said that comment about they're not the voice of the tomorrow, they're the voice of now, that is total Martha Graham. She says, great artists aren't ahead of their times. They are their times.
Hear, hear.
And that was just beautiful. So, the first question, Brendan, is what's the best thing for a human being? I got that from Wilhelm Reich. He said the best thing for a human being is another human being.
Okay.
And the last question is, in basically, I mean, that's what you said. You said talking to people, communion, love, being alive. The last question, what gives you the most optimism, is what they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life. And he said, other people. So, we're all in this together. And that's why I love so much what we've had through venues like Beyond Baroque that we can form a community with people and share our commonality of language about language. So, Brendan, thank you so much. This has been truly enlightening. I will send you an email, and I hope you sign up for another date. And
Absolutely.
even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Thank you so much.